Hi, everyone. Good morning. Hope everyone's enjoying breakfast. I heard someone said it's the best bacon they've ever had. I'm Dulce Vasquez. I'm Assistant Vice President for Strategic Advancement here at Arizona State University. We are so excited to be collaborating with the McCain Institute on this event today, which, as everyone knows, is extremely timely, so we're so thrilled to have our guests today. I wanted to share a little bit about why you are sitting in Arizona State University's building in downtown Los Angeles. Is this anyone's first time in the building? Oh, we got a ton. Welcome. We're so excited. We opened this building the summer of 2021. Arizona State is our neighbor to the east here in California. This is the second largest recruitment pool for Arizona State is Californians. We send about 6,000 California students annually to Arizona. In addition, we've got another 18,000 ASU online students that reside in California to add to the almost over 60,000 alumni of ASU that reside in California. So we have a large and deep footprint. We have some alumni in the room. You want to raise your hands for alumni? Yes, amazing. So we opened up this space because we saw a need in this community, particularly Los Angeles, obviously, as lots of students are shut out of different systems. We can augment their education and meet them where they are. So this is an incredible piece of history that we get to shepherd. This was a Julia Morgan designed building for William Randolph Hearst, one of the Hearst properties, the Los Angeles Examiner back in 1914 when it opened. And we get to continue that legacy. We have our ASU Cronkite School of Journalism located on the third floor here, so we continue to have that legacy of making sure that media and press is important, it's valuable, it's true, and people appreciate that as part of our democracy. And we're thrilled to have, obviously, the McCain Institute that also furthers democracy, human rights, and leadership as a legacy organization of Senator McCain, who embodied all of those values. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests for today. First, Dr. Evelyn Farkas is the Executive Director of the McCain Institute and has 3 decades of experience working on national security and foreign policy in the U.S. government, private sector, and for international organizations overseas. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia during the Obama administration and ran for Congress in 2020 in New York's 17th Congressional District. She was previously president of Farkas Global Strategies, a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and the Atlantic Council, and a national security contributor for NBC, MSNBC. And up next is our featured guest today. Mr. David Axelrod is a preeminent American political strategist and commentator and the former chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama. He currently serves as a distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago, professor of practice at Arizona State University, and senior political commentator for CNN. He is the host of The Axe Files, which I already know there are so many fans of that here, a top-rated podcast featuring in-depth conversations with public figures across the political spectrum. Mr. Axelrod is also a member of the McCain Institute's Global Advisory Council, which supports the McCain Global Leaders Program. Please help me welcome our guests, Dr. Evelyn Farkas and Mr. David Axelrod.
Good morning, and fun to see some old friendly faces in the crowd. I am Evelyn Farkas. You heard the introduction. I run the McCain Institute. I've been in this position for 2 years. The McCain Institute is proudly a part of the ASU family. We work hard, motivated by the legacy of the late Senator John McCain and his family, to advance democracy, human rights, and human dignity in America and all around the world. We have leadership programs, and we are very honored and grateful to have David Axelrod as our advisor for our McCain Global Leaders Program, which is our secret campaign to create mini John McCains all over the world. These are mid-career and rising professionals. For the last 2 years, the cohort has been focused on democracy, so we have people like Sunny Cheng, very well-known Hong Kong former legislator, opposition leader, and others in these cohorts. We expect one of them someday to lead their country, one or more of them to lead their country, and we watch with great excitement as we see them demonstrating the leadership qualities that they learn through the program, which is character-driven leadership. You make decisions based on your values. So with that, I want to say welcome to David Axelrod.
Thank you.
I want to say a few other things about you. First of all, ASU is excited because you're a professor of practice here.
Yes.
And I know Dr. Crow is excited to also have been able to host your podcast, The Axe Files, on ASU premises.
Yes.
So thank you for that.
He did a podcast with me. It was really, I recommend it to everyone. He's such an interesting guy.
Well, most people don't think of higher education leaders as leaders in global democracy, in American democracy and global democracy. He really fits that bill, though, in everything he's doing.
He does,
Yeah.
and he's sort of reinventing the public university in a way that's inclusive and innovative. It's really a great story.
Yeah.
But I just want to say one word about the McCain Institute and my involvement with it. There are people who might find that unusual because I ran a campaign against John McCain in 2008. He probably would have found it unusual at that time as well. But at no time in that campaign did I not continue to admire him as a patriot, as someone who cared deeply about this country. We had differences on issues, but I never went to sleep at night. I would have been deeply disappointed if we had lost that election, but I wouldn't have gone to sleep at night worrying about the future. It's important. I raise it because particularly in these times, it's important to recognize that whatever divides us should not eclipse those things that unite us as Americans, as human beings. John McCain understood that. That's why he was an effective legislator. So part of my involvement is I love the work that the Institute does in his name, but I also want to lift up the example that he set.
Well, you have done so in your life. And I want to note for the audience that this is being recorded, so you can tell everyone afterwards who was sleeping in that they are welcome to watch this. I think we're very lucky to have you on this day. You, of course, are famous for having been the strategist to launch a guy named Barack Obama into the White House and then keep him there for a second term. And then, of course,
The American people helped.
The American people helped, yes, but you took a chance on him, if you will. You believed in him, and then you wrote a book about it and your life called "Believer: My 40 Years in Politics," I believe was the subtitle,
Yes.
And that is another reason why I think you're the perfect person to be associated with the McCain Institute, ASU, and here today, because you believe in our democracy. We're at a really critical moment today. I'm not going to talk about Donald Trump just yet. I'm going to hold off a little bit because I think we need to frame our conversation about what happened yesterday in the broader context of what's happening in America and around the world.
Yeah. No, this is a frayed moment for democracy. We had this sense, from the time that the Soviet Union crumbled, that the wall fell, that liberal democracy was on the march. Liberal democracy is under assault today, and the forces of autocracy are on the march. And what we're being reminded of is that democracy was never meant to be a gift. It is a project. It was speculative from the start, and it requires the engagement of citizens to preserve it, to strengthen it, and we're being tested. And as are citizens of other countries around the world, and certainly the events in Ukraine have great implications for this, but people will be looking at our own election, and I say that not as a partisan point. I mean, there are partisan arguments to be made about policy and so on, but there is a larger issue, and certainly the events of the last 24 hours speak to it.
Yeah, and this conversation is about the polarization that we are experiencing here in America and the impact on the world, because the world has looked to us, for better or worse, to be the prime example of democracy, a flourishing democracy, and our democracy is in crisis. So before we turn to kind of the present day and even the future, can we talk a little bit about how we got here? Because a lot of people point to 2016. Again, a lot of people make it about Donald Trump. In 2016, we know that we had foreign interference.
Yeah.
I was somebody who rang the alarm quite early because I'd come out of the Obama administration. I knew what Putin was all about, and I was hearing what my former colleagues were saying. So I understood what Putin was all about, though I was also shocked that he would take such a risky action to target our elections. But at the same time, many other people have written books saying, no, the polarization goes back further. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on, was 2016 a big turning point, or was it just the continuation of a process?
Well, I think it was a continuation of a process, and it was a reaction to to events. There are several layers of this. I want to put a pin in the mention of what happened in 2016, Putin, and what we're seeing today, frankly, in our election, because social media has become a very cheap and effective way for our adversaries to lob bombs into the American democracy that can't be seen but are certainly felt. But look, we've gone through this whole century, we've gone through a series of very jarring experiences as a country. I would argue even before that, that the impact of globalization, automation, had profound impacts on different parts of the country, different segments of the country, produced winners and losers that had a polarizing effect. We were engaged in 2 wars for 20 years. That had a jarring effect on the country. We went through a once-in-a-century economic crisis in 2008 and 2009 that was punishing to millions and millions of Americans. And there, too, there was a perception that some people, that the people who propagated it, the sort of financial schemers who propagated it, sort of got away whole, whereas people lost their homes, their jobs, and so on. That was a radicalizing event. So there was a lot that went, that went into the pre-Trump era. And yes, I get asked all the time, well, what was how much of it was a reaction to the election of the first African-American president? I think that was an element as well. And all of it was fodder for demagogic appeals. And, Donald Trump, people make a mistake when they belittle him. He didn't stumble into this. He has a genius, I call it a feral genius, for understanding the vulnerabilities of people and how to exploit them. And he spoke to some of that anxiety that people felt. He also tied into race and other things. But no, he wasn't the first. But I want to return to the social media
Yeah, if you could talk about technology.
Yeah, technology generally. Technology, the thing about technology is it churns at an exponential rate, faster and faster all the time. And that has certainly been true in social media. The combination of social media and big data and the ability to scoop up data through social media has had a very insidious effect. Because now these algorithms know more about us than we know about ourselves. And the goal of the social media platforms is not political in the main. The goal is to keep people online to buy stuff, and so they can sell advertising. But the great insight of these technologists and these algorithms is the thing that keeps people online more readily than anything is fear, anger, resentment, conspiracy theories, and they have enough data about us to know what our hot buttons are. And the result of it is we get shoved further and further into silos in which our views are not always informed, but they're always affirmed. And everybody outside that silo is not just someone who has a different background or a different point of view, but is an enemy, is threatening, is menacing. And that is a very dangerous thing for democratic societies. And that's, of course, what Putin and the Chinese and the Iranians and so on, North Koreans, they all recognize that, and they throw logs on the fire, and they're doing it now. And one of the great challenges for us, even as technology churns at an ever faster rate, I mean, now we're entering the AI era, which is going to have profound impacts. We have to be alert to this and understand how we're going to, how we can push back on it. And that responsibility belongs to our leaders, yes, but also to us as citizens. And we often let ourselves off the hook because we have grievances about politicians and their failures. And, you know, I'm well aware of the flaws in our system and the failures of leadership. But we as citizens have some obligation to be alert to the fact that we're being manipulated at times, and that we need to be exposing ourselves to a broader array of sources of information, and we need to scrutinize those sources of information before we act on the kind of provocations that have become so common.
I think that's right. I think generally speaking, most people agree with you that there's a problem in terms of people getting siloed sources of information. And then there's the other thing that continues to be shocking to people like myself, that you recognize, you mentioned foreign interference. So it started in 2016, you know, with Russia, then Russia working ever closer. I ran for Congress in 2020 in New York, and I could see now Americans using Kremlin talking points, and we fast forward, that's now almost normal. But there are still Americans who don't believe that the Russians are actually trying to influence our politicians and trying to influence how they should vote. And what do we do about that?
Well, this was, you know, I mean, one of the byproducts of Trump's ascension to power is that he wanted to actively discredit that notion because he wanted to discredit the idea that the Russians helped him get elected. And he's very, very, you know, effective at branding these things. I mean, you know, the fact that 70% of Republicans believe the last election, which is the most scrutinized election in the history of the country, was somehow stolen, speaks to that. But and now if you raise, there's no doubt that the Russians, you talk to any of CISA or any of these folks, and they're very clear on it. The Russians are, and they've become more. And
the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, they've all learned.
All become more sophisticated as well, because now they create, you know, bots that start provocative memes, and then they eliminate them. But by that time, other people have picked up the memes, and then they just amplify those other people, amplifying the meme that they started and then walked away from. So it's harder to detect. This is, when we consider our sovereignty and the state of our democracy, this is a real issue. But if you raise it in the if you raise it today, you know, you're going to get a significant amount of resistance, residual to 2016, when the Russians did what they did and Trump denied that they did it.
And on top of that, we have, of course, the first time in U.S. history, January 6th, that the 2021, that the transfer of power was not peaceful in the United States. First time in our history. Yet there are still Americans, including Donald Trump and other lawmakers, who continue to insist that there was no violence, that a massive crowd of people armed with bear spray and flag staffs and other things that were weaponized against police officers who rushed into the Capitol, broke into the Capitol, destroyed property, said they were going to find Nancy Pelosi, and the lawmakers in there, Republicans and Democrats, believed that their life was hanging in the balance.
Well, Vice President of the United States.
And the Vice President of the United States, that's a whole nother component of this, exactly, that they were going to find Pence and hang him. All of that has been denied. And I think that's also, before we get to the international aspect of it, just looking at it as Americans, how is that possible, and how does that influence the elections going forward?
Yeah, well, what it is more than anything a reflection of the power of Trump and over the party. And you saw it in the reaction to New York yesterday. I mean, I didn't love the New York case. I believe that Trump was guilty.
Okay, we're going to Donald Trump now.
Guilty as charged. No, but there's a bigger point here, and that is one of the pillars of a democracy is the rule of law, and the idea that no one is above it, and that whole principle, in addition to everything else, goes out the window if the President of the United States holds himself above the law. And if Trump should win this election, the much more serious cases, including the one involving January 6th, will go out the window. And what does that mean for our democracy? Before you get to any other issues, like what does it say? What it says is, that this is the nightmare of the founding fathers,
right?
Who wanted a president and not a king, and wanted to ensure that everyone was beholden to the Constitution and the law. One thing I want to say, just as an aside, I said to all of you, I did an event a few weeks ago in Chicago with George Stephanopoulos, who just wrote a book called The Situation Room, Presidents in Crisis. And it's a really, if you like history and you're interested in national security, it's a fantastic book because it's history through the eyes of the men and women who staff the Situation Room.
Oh, interesting.
And so they have an intimate, view of events, and it starts in the Kennedy administration, which is when the Situation Room was created. But one of the stories in the book, it goes through every administration and crises they faced, but one of them was the guy who was staffing the Situation Room on January 6th. And George said, what was the most difficult part of that? I mean, part of it was they couldn't speak with the president because he wasn't interested in it and never called down to say, how do we stop this? But they said the most difficult thing was how close we came to losing the vice president.
Yeah. So you're mentioning presidents. I wonder, I don't want to put you too much on the spot here, given your close relationship with President Obama, but in all of this, is there a role for former presidents, living former presidents? We've seen Presidents Obama and Bush come out very rarely in writing and in person. As a strategist, given your concern for our country, what would you recommend to either president or all living former presidents?
Evelyn, one of the things I remember was from my time in the White House was President Obama saying to me, both President Bush's elder and junior, HW and W, they've taught me a lesson in how to be a former president because I'm sure they don't love everything I've done, but they've given me the space to do it. And he said, and I think that's the appropriate thing for, now he didn't anticipate Donald Trump. So that has put that to the test, and I think he's tried to find the right balance. You know, and he said at the time, I will step out at moments when I think that there are fundamental constitutional values. He certainly campaigned, and I think he will again. You know, President Bush has been much more circumspect. I have no doubt how he feels about some of these things. But, you know, I'm sure there's an element of, do I want to throw myself right into the middle of the fray again, which can be very unpleasant.
Yeah, because you would think that a president could reduce the polarization, but it's not a guarantee, and then he could, and the fear is that then he becomes, you know, his actions become politicized and
yeah, and honestly,
contribute.
I'm not sure. I think that you would think that having presidents of both parties out there speaking would be useful, but you also can be used.
Yeah.
And by, you know, in this case, probably the Trump forces, you know, more readily. But so I think I think these former presidents. Here's the thing: every president I've known, you know, I've known, which goes back to.
Well, 40 years.
Yeah, it goes back to Lincoln. Has viewed themselves as the president of the whole country. And, you know, when we won in 2008, George W. Bush could not have been kinder to us in the transition. Everything we asked for, he did. All our counterparts in the White House, Ed Gillespie was mine, who called us over and met with us to tell us how they've done the job and to familiarize us with the White House. President Bush had a luncheon with all the former presidents and President Obama just to discuss the job. And I'll never forget it. And President Bush was personally kind to me and encouraging to me. And he gave me the best advice, which you'll appreciate because you've served. He said, just appreciate every moment because this is going to be the ride of your life and it's going to go by faster than you'll ever imagine, which was true. But George Bush did it not because he loved everything that Barack Obama said in the campaign, for sure. He did it because he thought it was his responsibility as a trustee of the democracy, just as President Obama felt when he handed the reins over to President Trump. They are institutionalists. Institutions are important to democracy. If we have leaders who fundamentally don't believe in rules and laws and norms and institutions, that has really profound implications for a democracy, and that's what concerns me.
Yeah. So before I turn to the foreign policy aspect, and I will note that Bob Gates the former Secretary of Defense, did come out recently and support President Biden on his Israel policy, which was interesting.
Noteworthy because he hasn't been a fan of.
No, he wrote like every decision that Biden made as vice president when he was the worst. Exactly. Yeah. So he panned him across the board unequivocally in writing, and now has come out. So to me, that also.
In defense of the president, let me just say, I had the privilege to be in the Situation Room for this. I think there were 9 meetings in 2009 to talk about where to go in Afghanistan.
Right.
You'll remember that. And the then vice president, was challenging to the Pentagon and the military about their plans. I think history probably would look back at that a lot more approvingly than Secretary Gates did.
Yes, and as somebody who worked in the Pentagon during that time, it was just the groupthink, if you will, of the defense establishment that the president and vice president were facing.
Yeah.
So if I could, before we go to the international scene and the audience, I want to ask you, what should we be looking for in the upcoming presidential, and then not just presidential, but congressional races?
Yeah. I think you should look to an inspiring pageant of democracy. No, I'm not. That was what I hoped.
Senator Manchin just said he's going to be an independent, which is interesting.
Yeah, well, that is interesting because West Virginia has basically been ceded to the Republicans. If Senator Manchin were to run as an independent in West Virginia, that would be interesting. He also could run for governor there.
And that's something in the spirit of John McCain. It's not about the party, it's about the country.
Right.
So if people don't, if the party isn't where you are and doesn't uphold your values, then become an independent and, make sure that you transmit to the people what it is that you would like to advance.
Yeah, because we are so polarized now, and if you're wearing the blue jersey or the red jersey, that almost means more than what's in your heart and in your head, and that's not good for democracy. Look, this could be a very, I think, close presidential race because we are so polarized. By definition, I mean there are blue. One of the great inspiring speeches that Barack Obama made in 2004 was at the Democratic Convention, where he said, there are no blue states, there are no red states. There's just the United States of America. That is, sadly, we have become much more polarized since that time. And so that guarantees a close election, and it's going to take place largely in 6 states, because of the electoral system. Right now, if the election were today, and I've said this publicly before, I think Trump would win. Now, I've said that before yesterday. No one really knows what the impact of that is. One of the impacts is he's apparently raised a lot of money off of it. But I really don't know. And it's very hard to poll. Some polls suggest that he would lose a few points if he were convicted of a felony. I think these projective polls on issues like this are deeply suspect, and I don't know what's going to happen. But what I do believe is this. I had a podcast the other day with, I do this podcast called Hacks on Tap, and we had Chris Christie on, who knows Trump very well, and he said everybody's focused on the impact of this verdict on the public. The real question is, what is the impact on Trump himself?
That's a great point.
Said Trump fears, the 2 things he said Donald Trump fears the most are bankruptcy and prison. And he will be undone by a verdict. Now, we just left, he was like almost an hour into a kind of stream of consciousness press conference in New York that was unhinged. And the question is, how does that affect these small cohort of swing voters who are going to decide this election?
The independents, right?
There was a guy in a focus group that I saw who was a guy who voted for Trump last time, is trying to decide this time, has real questions about Biden, and I'll get to that. But he said, living with Trump is like living with a neighbor who runs his leaf blower 24/7. He said, you just never get any sleep. And that aspect of Trump may come to the fore as a result of this, and the sense that he's more focused on his own problems than our problems. And I think that is a potential opening for Biden, if they handle it right. I think they have in the first 24 hours to talk about, I'm here to fight for you, and here's how, and this is the future I foresee. He's fighting for himself and consumed by his past. And you got to ask yourself, does his search for vengeance and retribution, does that actually benefit you? Is he going to get to your problem? And then there are specific, issues on which they get. But Biden has to overcome this age issue. And I was very public about my concern about it. I have great regard for him, loved working with him. I think some of the things he's done as president will have generational importance. I think his steadfast support for Ukraine has been hugely important in the world. But it doesn't answer the question that I think people have about his age. And even though he and Trump are virtually the same age, 3 years difference, one guy seems a lot more energetic than the other. So it becomes kind of a race between creaky and crazy. And
at the end of the day, you just have to make the choice. And
yeah, but I mean, the question that Biden needs to really give a sense of where he wants to go. What would the difference in the future be between him and Trump? On issues like healthcare and the cost of pharmaceuticals, certainly abortion rights, and fundamental tenets of democracy. There are profound differences, and he just, what he should avoid, and I've said this as well, is the country is not in a very charitable mood right now. They're not giving out ribbons and trophies for leadership right now because there's a sense, and I think it's a hangover from the pandemic. There is a real sense of anxiety, and you see it. 2/3 of the country think the country's on the wrong track. People have a very warped perception of the economy based on, if you look at statistics, data about how we're performing versus other countries, jobs and so on. But it's very much through the prism of their own lived experience. If you go to the store and things cost 20% more than they did before the pandemic, you notice that. You may be getting wage increases, but they're getting eaten up by these price increases. So what that suggests is don't go out and brand the economy with your name. That's a basic rule of, there may be some marketers here, basic rule of marketing. If everybody hates the product, don't put your name on it.
Well, and the other thing is that I'm not a domestic political strategist, even though I ran for Congress, I lost. But he might consider highlighting the team rather than himself, even though, of course, at the end of the day, as we've learned, the president really matters. Who the president is matters.
It does.
But if you highlight the team,
yes,
that might get you farther in this case.
Well, one of the things that I would suggest to the Biden campaign is that if your candidate has communications challenges, and the president does, I think part of the reason people have the perception they have is however competent he is, he's not a particularly competent communicator anymore, and that's been hamstringing him. But he's got a phalanx of surrogates who can go out there and carry the ball,
Janet Yellen,
but they need to know what the play is. And so that's another reason why he needs to develop. There needs to be, the Republican message is clear. The world's out of control and Biden's not in command. Trump is strong, Biden's weak. That's it. And everything is fitted into that. The question is, what is the Democratic message? And, it's almost June. It's time to unfurl it.
Yeah. So before we go to the audience, I want to just say a few words about the international stuff. I was on Meet the Press. They did a special on democracy and focused a lot on elections. They had the Arizona, Pennsylvania, the people who are in charge of elections, and then they turned to me and said, "What is the international community thinking? What are they doing? What's their reaction to our upcoming elections?" And I said, fear and trepidation.
Yes.
So, and that's widely recognized, not just because of what's happening in our country, but that these things have a dynamic of reinforcement. So you have, quasi-fascists in other countries, like Hungary,
Yes.
Member of NATO and the European Union, feeding off of Donald Trump, encouraging Donald Trump. That's Viktor Orban, the head of Hungary.
Yes.
And others, across the board in all countries, even if they're not running the country. And, even in big allies like France and Germany, you have far-right parties that are in the respective parliaments. So what do you say to and frankly, what I think this issue of confidence is important, that somehow we're not radiating confidence and they're not confident in us. So what do you say to our allies and partners, and what should we do in order to reassure them? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, no, you're quite right, because I have I just met with a prominent leader from another country before I flew
Maybe
out
at the
here
McCain
yesterday.
Institute Sedona Forum?
And, a lot of what you say was reflected. Listen, we exported democracy, and people look to us to be a beacon, and that beacon is flickering in their view, and they worry about, the idea of Trump in the first place was jarring. The idea that he could return after all of this is terrifying, and it erodes confidence. I think the message that we have to send is that our institutions may be bending, but they're pretty durable, and we've been tested before. There is a cadre of very impressive young leaders in this country. I mean, the tragedy of this election is that in both parties, those leaders have been stymied because they weren't going to challenge the leaders, the present leaders. So, but we have some really impressive leaders, governors, members of Congress, members of the cabinet on the Democratic side, Republicans.
And Republican side.
Yes,
yeah.
we've seen them at the Sedona Forum. There are impressive Republican leaders who I admire. They just need to be given the cover and the opportunity to step forward. And that, there are a lot of Americans who have a strong interest in that happening. So we may go through some choppy waters here, but America has a record of navigating through the choppy waters and getting to calmer seas. And that is a gift of democracy. It gives us at least the opportunity to do that. And we need to reassure people that there's a solid core who want that. But, I don't think we can be Pollyannish. This is a problem. And you mentioned Viktor Orban. The thing I fear is the Orbanization of American democracy, which is democracy in form, but not in practice.
Right. That is a real danger. But I like where you were going, though, before you brought us back to Viktor Orban, the believer in you. No, that's okay. For those in the audience who don't know, David's book was actually read by Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who was poisoned numerous times by Vladimir Putin, ultimately jailed and sent to an Arctic prison. And in that Arctic prison, he read The Believer. And he found that it was useful and informative. So I think as Americans, we should also find something useful and informative in the advice that you have in that book and beyond. And so as the last question that I ask before I turn it to the audience, what advice do you have as somebody who believes in our democracy for the individuals in this room? As an individual, as a regular citizen, what can we do, each of us?
Yeah. Well, look, first of all, I think we should acknowledge that democracy has forever been a battle between cynicism and hope. And the way the cynics win is to extinguish our hope. And so it's really important that we lean in and not lean out. That if you care about this democracy, if you're despairing about some of the things that you've seen, then lean in, participate, vote, organize, donate, find candidates who inspire you and support them. This ultimately is on us. So my great fear is that people just submit to the cynicism and submit to the sense of hopelessness that, and that's what allows autocrats to thrive. I will tell you this, though, at Arizona State and at the Institute of Politics I founded at the University of Chicago, I also meet all the time with young people, and they're not giving up. They're eager for us to get out of the way.
Right.
And I don't blame them. Yeah. But they believe that they have the power to change the world. And so my last point is, let's support them, give them guidance, give them encouragement. And that's why I so love the Global Leaders program. You want to be inspired. Meet some of these young leaders from around the world who are risking their lives in some cases to make their countries better, stronger, fairer, more just. And you meet these young people, and it's very hard to be a cynic. So that's the gift that the global leaders have given me.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. Well, with that, I would like to turn it to the audience. I see my dear old friend, or longtime friend, Colonel Downey, asking a question.
We have time for a few questions, so please wait till I come around to you guys with the microphone.
Oh, thank you, Dulce. Well, I'm Richard Downey, president of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall, and thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. This is just
expert on Latin America, former head of the institute at NU, focused on Latin America.
And so good to see you, Evelyn. Thank you. Building a bit on your last question, Evelyn, and your great response. One of the things that I understand is that those under 30 or 35, most of those get their news and information on social media. And you talked a little bit about social media before and how those algorithms can be pretty nefarious in terms of their impact. You're a professor of practice now at ASU. You've probably seen this. I'm encouraged the fact that you see that spirit in younger folks, but using the expression you said earlier, having all of this demographic get their news from social media is probably not good for democracy. So I'm wondering if you've seen this, or if you have any thoughts about how we get out of this situation.
How do we get them to read the real news?
Well, yeah, and also to reach beyond their silos. One of the things that we did at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, there was such a strong reaction in 2016 to Trump's election, and a lot of the folks on campus, faculty and students, couldn't fathom how that could happen. And I actually have a home in rural Michigan, and my wife called me the Saturday before that election, and she said, "Are you sure Hillary's going to win?" And I said, "Michigan," she was asking specifically, and I said, "I don't know, but I'm just telling you their polling suggests they're going to win Michigan." She said, "Well, a bunch of our neighbors have Trump flags, and some of them voted for Obama, I know that. And you know what, my neighbors are good people. They're not monsters, they're not crazy, they're not racist, but they were struggling, and they wanted to know that their voices were being heard. And so anyway, we started at the university something called Bridging the Divide. We took a cohort of students from the University of Chicago and a cohort from Eureka College in Central Illinois, which is where Ronald Reagan attended, a small rural college, more conservative, Trump-oriented area. And then some students, later we added a cohort from Arupe College, which is a 2-year college in Chicago connected to Loyola University, where a lot of immigrant students go. And they would spend a weekend downstate talking to people about their problems and lives and concerns. We do focus groups in both, and then they do it in the city. We do focus groups in both places with voters. They sit behind the mirror and watch how people talk about politics, often invoking caricatures that were ugly about the other, right? You know, in Chicago about people downstate, and downstate about people in Chicago. And they talk about what they see. And it's an incredibly moving experience to watch them work through their differences. I saw one young man in one of these focus groups in Chicago from downstate Illinois, rural Illinois. Here, I asked the moderator to ask the Chicago people why they thought people voted for Trump from downstate, so your neighbors downstate. And they'd go around and they say, well, you know, they're uneducated, they're ignorant, they're racist, and you could see this kid tensing up, and we had a discussion afterwards, and I said, you know, Hunter, you looked like you were reacting there. And he said, listen, my father is a union electrician who worked at a coal-fired electric plant, and he's going to lose his job because the EPA is closing it down. He said there are a lot of reasons why people might have voted for Trump. We're not all stupid. We're not all racist. And it engendered a really interesting conversation with everyone in the room, where the immigrant students said, you know, I'd love to have a dialogue, but it's hard when my parents are being demonized in the way that Trump has demonized them. And they really bond, honestly, by the end of these experiences. We need to somehow scale those kinds of conversations. We need to get out of our silos and see each other as human beings, and with a common humanity, and frankly, you know, common responsibilities and benefits as Americans. And, you know, we have to really push hard against these gale force winds that are pushing us into these silos, and we need leaders who are intent on doing that. So, you know, that's a big mission, but, you know, I would urge all of you, in whatever way you can, in your smaller, you know, small or big realm, to try and encourage dialogue and understanding, and appeals to those common elements of humanity, our common humanity, because it's, I'll just say a last thing on this. I'm sorry you put a quarter in and you're getting 10 plays here. But I do a lot of speaking with Karl Rove. This is a source of irritation to some of my friends in my tribe. But Karl's a friend. And one of the reasons he's a friend is that I was reading his autobiography, and I found this common thing in our history. He lost his mother to suicide. I lost my father to suicide. And I called Karl and I said, you know, if you and I went and talked about suicide awareness, we could probably get a lot of attention, and that would be good. And we started doing that. And now we do a lot of programs about politics. And we disagree, and, you know, but it's clear to people that we have regard for each other as human beings. And that actually is why we get booked. I mean, we're sort of peers anyway, but, there's so much that we share that we don't even know. And social media doesn't want us to know. There's no profit in us getting along. So we need to be more sophisticated about that. And we need to teach our young people to be more sophisticated about it as well.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for your comments this morning.
Can you identify yourself?
My name is Brandon Gerson. I'm actually an alumni here. I work in venture capital. I have two questions. I guess pick one. Do you have an opinion on how RFK will influence this potential election, and is there a potential path for him? And also, if you have any comments towards how Israel could perhaps be benefited as a nation with either of the presidential candidates.
With either president.
What's the best outcome for Israel to continue as a state?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I'll leave the Israel question to you.
Okay. there.
But I have my thoughts on that. I think RFK, listen, this is a marginal election, so anything can influence it. In 2016, the Green Party candidate, who's on the ballot again this time, Jill Stein, got more votes than Trump's margin in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Presumably those votes would have gone to Hillary Clinton. So third-party candidates can be very influential here. And my point from the beginning on this was Trump has never gotten more than 46, maybe 47% of the vote. Anything that lowers the threshold, I think, is in the main good for him. Now, Robert Kennedy is, his appeal is actually more to Trump voters than to Biden voters at this point. There's still people residual to his name, know him from his environmental stuff, that are Democrats or left. He's very anti-corporate, very anti-establishment. That has appeals on the left and right. So it's not clear to me where it all nets out. He made a statement this morning denouncing the verdict yesterday, I saw, so he seems to be making a play here. I will say that it's very possible that third-party candidates will have a role here in terms of determining the outcome of some of these very close states, and I'd keep an eye on Michigan, on Wisconsin, and on Pennsylvania. Biden, I think, will need all three of those states because I think Nevada is very remote. He won it last time. Arizona's at risk. Georgia, much less promising, or less promising than it was last time. If these third-party candidates could tip this election.
So to answer the Israel question, this is going to be hard to do in a few words or briefly, but if you believe, as I believe, that Bibi Netanyahu, that the current Israeli leadership is too far right and not good for the state of Israel, for the future of Israel, for the Israeli people, then because he and his far right coalition partners don't believe in a two-state solution and don't have a strategy for peace and some kind of accommodation with the Palestinians, then you want a U.S. president who is going to be able to influence, pressure, willing to pressure the Israeli government to come up with a strategy and to work with the United States, with our allies, and with the Gulf states and other actors who are stakeholders in all of this. And because of that, I believe, there are many other reasons why I believe President Biden is a far better foreign policy president, but if you're looking at it purely from the perspective of what's best for the state of Israel, it's President Biden because, and I'm not saying his policy is perfect, because frankly I think he could be putting more pressure on Israel right now to help Israel get to some kind of resolution. The current situation, however, it would be worse with Trump, I believe, in office, because Trump, at least what we know from his track record, was very willing to give Netanyahu a blank, a free pass, if you will. Now, we don't know whether he would do that in the next term, but I think there's too much unknown, and I know that ultimately what the Biden people want is an Israeli state for the Jewish people, side by side with a Palestinian state. And at the end of the day, you can't go and relitigate what happened in the past. You have to go back to the Ottomans. We are in the current situation, which is horrific. So we need to freeze the war. We need to eliminate the Hamas threat, and then move forward from there. So that was probably too long, but that's my perspective on it.
Next question in the back.
Thank you so much for you both for being here. My name is Emmanuel Alcantar. I wanted to ask a bit about issues that you feel Democrats could be either messaging or legislating on at the federal level, or should be doing more at the state and local level that could deal with polarization and with some of the issues that we're seeing. I think about an issue like housing, for example. You spoke about how Americans' perceptions of the economy are based off of their lived experience. We've seen cities, inflation is a part of that, and we've seen cities and states who have done a lot on housing, sometimes on a bipartisan basis, is how we've been able to combat inflation and reduce cost of living. I was hoping if you could speak a little bit about if there's issues like housing, maybe there's other issues that you can speak to that you think Democrats could be talking more about, either federally or at the state and local level.
There is no question that Democrats should be speaking about the things that they are going to do and are doing, not just stuff that they have done, but that they are going to do and are doing ongoingly to deal with the issue of costs and housing availability, housing costs is a huge piece of that. And I think a major initiative on housing would be valuable and important. They're also ongoing, and I'm saying yes to your question, which I think was almost rhetorical in nature. We have to speak more to the housing crisis that so many people are feeling, and younger people in particular. But there are other issues that I think are important. I wept the night that we passed the Affordable Care Act during the Obama presidency, primarily because I have a child with a chronic illness, and I and my family, when I was a young reporter, we almost went bankrupt in what the health care system used to be. So, and now I've seen millions and millions of people who won't go through the terror that we went through, and Biden has worked to strengthen that.
Thanks also to John McCain.
Yes. John McCain was the hero of that story. But President Trump said earlier in this campaign that he would like to still repeal the Affordable Care Act. He was whistled off that, but there are so many things that could be done to strangle the Affordable Care Act administratively. That law has a lot of support and is a lot meaningful to a lot of Americans. That's on the ballot this November. That's a very tangible thing. The cost of prescription drugs, very tangible thing. Biden is doing stuff about it. Trump did not, would not. There has been, in fact, a lot of corporate abuse around the pandemic in terms of raising prices more than their costs went up. And so these kinds of predatory practices, Biden is going after them, will go after them. Trump will not. Trump just, energy prices, obviously, but Trump just gave the oil industry the opportunity to write their own regulations in exchange for $1 billion in campaign contributions. There's a lot to talk about here. I think there are problems that should be said and done about, and the cost of education, the cost of housing are two of them. But they also ought to be done in a comparative frame, because if those are the things that concern you, you're not going to get relief from Donald Trump. It's going to go in the wrong direction. Let me just say one last point, Evelyn, on this. Trump says he's going to impose a 60% tariff on all Chinese products, 10% on every tariff on every other foreign-produced good that comes across our border. He says he's going to take over the Fed and hold interest rates low artificially and permanently, and ask any economist what that's all going to do to inflation in this country. We're going to see inflation, if he actually could do that, the likes of which will make us nostalgic for where we are today.
And if I could add to that and bring us back to polarization, as the child of two Republicans, I think that what's been lost also with all of this.
Do they wonder where you went wrong, or?
Well, actually, my mother still considers herself a Republican, though she had to switch parties to vote for me in a primary. My father became an independent in protest of the Gulf War. But they were, die-hard Reagan, Nixon foreign policy. They fled communist Hungary. So they were New Yorkers, so very liberal. They didn't care about the social agenda. But they were fiscally conservative. And so I want to go back to that idea that inside the Republican Party, there's no debate right now, and there should be. I think the biggest problem that underlies everything that we talk about, and frankly, when I walk on the streets in the city here today, is income disparity. The income inequality has become so large. That is our crisis in America today. And there are Republican leaders who can say, I have a different stance when it comes to what you do with your taxes or how much you're taxed, but I would like to see a more level playing field for businesses, for example. I mean, that's business friendly. Let's not forget that, one of John McCain's heroes was Teddy Roosevelt. He was a trust buster. He was a guy who said there shouldn't be monopolies. There shouldn't be a couple, guys in a smoke-filled room getting rich, and by the way, also deciding elections. So I think at the end of the day...
He also said there should be national health care, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so polarization is also a polarization, it has resulted in a stifling of ideas and debate within the parties themselves, and certainly in the Republican Party.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I think the Republican Party is a bit incoherent right now because Trump is not an ideologue, and he doesn't really have a governing philosophy. It's sort of like, what can I sell at any given moment, and how is it going to affect me? And then the party has to, President Biden negotiated a pretty tough border law with James Lankford, one of the most conservative members of the Senate, and that would have passed. But for President Trump saying, no, we want the issue, we don't want the solution, because Biden will get credit for the solution. And the party followed him. So to have an honest policy debate, you first have to break free from that. Democratic Party, look, it's obvious that there are policy debates within the Democratic Party, but they're within the framework of sort of reality. People like to compare. Whenever I talk to my Republican friends, they say, well, we have our Marjorie Taylor Greens, you have your AOCs.
They're not the same.
And I always say to them, look, you may not believe that national health care is or should be our policy, or that we shouldn't be more aggressive about climate change, but those are like reasonable, rational debates. The idea that Jewish space lasers are causing forest fires in California, that's not a rational debate. That's stone cold nuts.
What Marjorie Taylor Greene said.
Yes, yeah. So I think, both parties have challenges, but the Democratic Party seems more coherent to me now than the Republican Party, there are a lot of good Republicans who would like to and are trying to do constructive things, but the back end of the dog is wagging, the whole dog here.
Yeah, it's interesting because while there has been...
Trying to not use the word ass.
Okay, thank you. While there has been polarization, interestingly, among those of us kind of policy elites, and you mentioned, people in Washington, people who study and work on these things, oddly, there has been a meeting in the middle. But it doesn't matter because it hasn't translated to the general public yet. So with that, I want to really thank David Axelrod for taking the time to be here with us today to share your wisdom on this really historic day, the day after a former president was indicted for campaign finance and other campaign violations, rather, of the law. I want to thank you for everything you do for young people, for the McCain Institute, for ASU, and for America. So with that, please join me in thanking David Axelrod.
Thank you. Thank you.